we're focusing on here is trying to dig a bit into some of the polarizations, some of the tensions that are affecting the world today, and therefore one of our major themes, which is bridges. Though sometimes when I talk about bridges, I note that bridges are walked on. So sometimes it's not the most comfortable position to be in. But one of the great themes that people talk about in terms of the assets, the comparative advantage of religious traditions, is their holistic vision. The common themes, the linkages, the interlinkages, the interconnections that we increasingly know are the centerpiece of world affairs today. So we're going to talk a bit about some of these divisions and some of the ways in which we're trying to cross different bridges and different polarizations. So I'm going to have to keep looking behind me just to remember the order, because I'm going to stick to the order.
You have it right in front of you.
Okay, I can, yes, okay, that's good. Thank you for reminding me. So I'm actually going to start with one of my colleagues, the Reverend Susan Hayward, who has been a colleague in many different settings. But let's start with one of the elephants in the room at the moment, which is the United States, and the demolition of the capacity of several different organizations that have been working to try to bridge the gulf between the religious and the secular institutions that deal with policy, with government policy. And I think Susie is particularly well placed. She spent many years working in the U.S. Institute of Peace. She's been also a scholar. She's actually writing her PhD dissertation at the moment on the topic.
My advisor.
And so she's going to give us some sense of what you see as the immediate fallout, and where are the divisions and how do we bridge them. And just as a warning to all of you, you will get a little sign at 3 minutes. We want to try to keep this as a conversation. So keep it short, please. The KISS principle, keep it short and sweet. But we also want to keep the conversation going. So over to you.
Okay, I will keep it short. Thank you, Katherine, and thank you to all of you for joining. So as Katherine mentioned, I have been involved over the years with doing some of this bridging work between the world of diplomacy and U.S. foreign policy and the world of faith. And I've done that in a couple different ways. One is by working with faith-based actors, especially in peace-building efforts through the U.S. Institute of Peace, but the other is in developing what we call the religious literacy of U.S. foreign policymakers and actors. So helping them understand how religion intersects with social and political and economic institutions and agendas, and how to understand the religious landscape in any given context in order to navigate it effectively, partner when it makes sense with religious actors and organizations in order to advance democracy, peace, human rights, development agendas, and so on and so forth. That was called strategic religious engagement. For a time, that's kind of how it became coined within U.S. foreign policy. Actually, during the first Trump administration is when that term rose to the fore as the reference point for this effort. And as Katherine mentioned, a lot of the places where that work was being done has now been dismantled in the second Trump administration. So USAID was a center of a lot of that work. The United States Institute of Peace, where I worked, it had a long-standing religion program. USIP no longer. Well, it's in a sort of existential, uncertain space right now. The efforts within the State Department, the U.S. Foreign Ministry, for strategic religious engagement has been shuttered. So the work continues a bit in the Defense Department. But I'm part of this effort now that is seeking in the diplomacy and development space to capture some of 4 decades of lessons, guidance, policy, about how to do that kind of bridging work between what we think of as secular institutions and then what we define as religious spaces and institutions and organizations. And I used all my time up with just giving that background. So let me just say one thing by way of how I'm thinking about this current moment right now is actually as an opportunity. Of course, there's a great deal of anxiety and concern about the shuttering of this particular work, because I still believe that it's incredibly critical to understand religious spaces and influences and factors and work with faith actors. I think a lot of us here would agree with that in order to advance these agendas and these priorities, especially at a time when we have democratic backsliding and there's this turn away from human rights and from commitments to peace in the US and elsewhere. But I also think the dismantling of some of these institutions, while I wouldn't have supported it, especially not in this way, creates an opportunity for rebuilding and reimagining how to integrate this work in the future in a way that's going to help us get past some of the challenges we had, trying to reform very calcified bureaucracies, organizations, and institutions that were operating already with sort of historic assumptions and ways of partnering and so on that were difficult to come up alongside and partner in authentic ways with faith communities. And to, we talk about efforts being siloed. Well, all the silos are gone at the moment. Mm-hmm. So I'm actually, maybe it's the Christian pastor in me, but I am kind of leaning into the hope of this as being an opportunity for us to, instead of trying to reform organizations that were showing a great deal of resistance to reform, being able to think anew about how to do development, how to do diplomacy moving forward, that can be far more systems-based, that can be far more flexible and open to approaching things in a way that's, isn't fixed from 50, 60, 70 years ago. So I'll stop there for now.
Well, thank you. And I should mention that the Berkley Center that several of us are associated with at Georgetown University has a new project, which is basically trying to preserve and protect the information that's been established, but even more to try to do some creative thinking about what we do next. Well, let's turn now to another colleague of mine, Jose Casanova, who, just to sort of give a snippet, he's considered the world expert on issues of religion and secularism. He has a book that we've been celebrating that was published, what is it now, 30 years ago? Something like that.
94.
On religion in the public square. But I think Jose focuses a lot on something we hear a lot about here, which is the divide, the supposed divide, let me give away a little my sense, between the secular and the religious. And what is secularism? Is it a thing? Is the religious a thing? And how do we think about those divides? Mm-hmm. Over to you, Jose.
Well, thank you. Yes, I've spent my life studying this divide, but trying to bridge the divide. So I'm a professor of theology and sociology, and I'm a sociologist among theologians and a theologian among sociologists. And I'm a religious voice among secular colleagues, and I am a secular voice among my religious co-religionists. We need to bridge this divide, especially today. For a long time, we religious people have been knocking on the door. Please let us sit on the table with you. We have something to say. Today, the secular table is broken. Secular politics at every nation in the world is broken. Global governance is broken. And we have a voice. And we have to use our moral voice to reset the table. We cannot simply think that we can simply reform what we have. Pope Francis, we heard what he did, but what he said, in Fratelli Tutti, he has a fantastic paragraph. He was writing Fratelli Tutti in the midst of the COVID epidemic, or crisis. And his point was, looking at how we have responded to the crisis, if you think that the only thing we need is just to reform what we are doing, we are not facing reality. We simply have to rethink our whole structure of doing things globally to precisely find global responses to the global challenges. And the religions, and particularly my own church, is the most global of any NGO and the most local of any other institution in the world. And it's how to use both global and local together. We heard Sister Esmirelli this morning. What difference does it make if all the bishops and all the parishes from Latin America to North America see themselves as one single church? And we have so many sisters here in these meetings. I was sitting with a sister from Zambia, very small congregation, only 40 somewhat members. Sisters, you have the power in the church. You have to use it. Your network is unique. You are so locally embedded. You do so much work in your own local community, but you have the power, if you link together, to do something at the transnational and at the global level as well. So to us, is the first time that actually Katherine has brought me to the Interfaith. I always hear from her all the story. I know what you are doing, but believe me, at a time when secular people cannot talk to one another, are polarized, we were accused, religious people, of being irrational, not knowing how to discuss, not knowing how to do dialogue. We are the model. Mm-hmm. We are the model because we have begun the process of recognizing each other as different and unique. What makes us different is each religion claims to be unique and different, and yet has a universal message to all of humanity. And this is what makes us different and unique. So we ask for accepting diversity in equality and working equally in diversity. And this is a model for the globe that we have to propagate, because the nation state as a model is based on exclusive nationalist egoism, and the global governance, whether the transnational United Nations or Davos, simply are structurally unable to respond to our global crisis. They've proven for the last 50 years they cannot respond to the global crisis. So we at least have to think, use our networks and our prophetic voice and our creativity to do something.
Thank you, Jose. Let's turn now to Bonnie Dougal. Bonnie has spent many years working within the United Nations system from many different angles, representing the Baha'i faith, but dealing with gender issues and everything else. But one of the divides that is a divide within the policy communities dealing with religion is between a focus on religious freedom, which is a whole world in itself, and what Susie was talking about, the religious engagement. And how do you see both the divides and the ways to bridge them?
Thank you so much, Katherine, and I'm so happy to follow Professor Casanova and Susan, because it's exactly what you were saying. The Ubuntu philosophy that we are talking about these days, at the core of that is our interconnectedness, and not just as human beings, but of these issues. I have been at our United Nations office for 31 years. My office has been there since 1948, and we were even at the League of Nations before that, engaging in these issues. And we started, my office and with some partners, we started the Faith and Feminism Network, exactly to do that, bridging the divide between the secular and the faith actors for gender equality. We've been trying very hard, and I work very closely with the Mormon representation at the UN on freedom of religion or belief issues. Unfortunately, we don't see, I mean, there's a lot, most of the members of the community that are working on freedom of religion at the international level come from faith traditions, and they're really committed to the issue. But we don't always see that translating on the ground. So I think that is one divide we need to see, because the congregants on at the grassroots aren't always aware of what's happening regarding freedom of religion globally. And very few know that there's a special rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief to whom you can send complaints or ask questions or read the reports that they're producing, both on a thematic level, also on at the level of different communities that are facing difficulties. Very rarely do you have faith communities standing up and making statements on behalf of other faith communities that might be suffering, especially when it's at local and national levels. So, and that would be extremely powerful. But we need to do this better, because if we were working together, the impact would be so much greater and impactful. So those are some of the challenges there. I mean, I could keep talking. There's a lot more to be said, and hopefully we will as the conversation unfolds.
Great. Well, let's turn now to the African focus specifically, and Ambassador Salah Hamad is in the context of the African Union. I'd be interested in what you see as the sort of polarizations and the divides that have something to do with religion. Obviously, there is the whole complex question of conflict, but there's also uniting behind moving in a positive direction towards development and humanitarian assistance. So how do you see the divides and the bridges?
Thank you so very much, Dr. Katherine, for giving me the floor, and also for inviting the African Union Commission to be part of this conversation. I'm delighted and honored to be part of a panel that is gender balanced as part of this wonderful conference. I also wish to bribe my daughter here to give me an extra minute if possible. I'll give you a piece of chocolate later. I'm bribing her because simply the question is not easy to answer within 3 minutes, but I will do my best. As we all know, that the African Union Commission is an intergovernmental organization that currently has a member of 55 member states, African member states. The African Union Commission is the Secretariat of the African Union, and the African Union mandate is to, of course, produce and develop policies, instruments, treaties, strategies, programs, activities that assist the 55 member states at the national level to promote good governance, democracy, rule of law, human rights, and of course, stability, peace and security, and development. And at that level of developing the process, we have really came to understand and to be convinced that we need to extend bridges and reach out to various entities, organizations, and I would say groups of various school of thoughts and religions, civil society, media, academia, in order to enrich the process so that we can try to achieve the ultimate goals of developing a continent that is united, prosperous, and peaceful. And as a result, throughout the process of the development of policies, the various policies, instruments, and pronouncements, we found it extremely, I would say, beneficial to the African Union and also to our member states to involve the religious institutions. We currently have a number of memorandum of understandings, MOUs, with various institutions. But lately we realized that there is another bridge that we are yet to cross. That bridge is that the organizations we are partnering with, they don't really take into consideration the participation of women and youth. And therefore, we were able to, or forced to some extent, I would say, or obliged, to develop two strategies that are quite important. One of them is the women empowerment strategy, and the other one is the youth engagement strategy. And the purpose of these two strategies is that while we are discussing or negotiating an MOU with any entity that intends to partner with the African Union, to make sure that the MOU has elements or references to the need to engage youth and women. And I think if we see today, most of our participants here, if they are not youth, they are at least youth at heart, of course. But we really need, I would say, there's really need to involve the youth, because they are not really the leaders of tomorrow, they are also the leaders of today as well. And why we need to focus on youth? Africa is a very young continent, as we all know, with a population of 1.4 billion, but 65% of this number is below the age of 35. So that is why there's really need to involve the youth. We have really tried our best to also partner with religious institutions when it comes to peace buildings, peace negotiations, and also post-conflict reconstruction. But we realize that the message is always on the top with the religious leaders, but it does not really come down or trickle down to reach the youth and those who are the agents of change and the agents of destruction based on the instructions or the guidance that they receive from the religious leaders. Let me end by saying that there's always, especially from the African Union perspective, that there's really need to join hands, because promoting peace and security in Africa, promoting development in Africa is a collective responsibility. And we count heavily on our religious institutions, the various religious institutions we have in Africa, to share that message all the way from the top down to, down to the bottom. So then those who are far away from the media outreach, from the media connections, can get the message through the church, the temple, the mosque, and other religious institutions. So certainly, it's quite important to sustain that partnership and to enhance it and to strengthen it. Thank you very much.
Good.
Well, thank you
That was good.
Thank you for highlighting two issues that are running through this whole meeting, which is obviously the roles that women play, which has, I think, particular challenges in a religious setting, but also youth. There's a fascinating book, called Youthquake. I don't know if you've seen it, which is about the extraordinary demographic projections and current realities that are very specific to Africa. And so with that, I can turn to Brian Adams, he's coming, he wants to bring up the rear. So Brian is next. And the question for you, basically, you've been very much part of ACWE and the session, the day-long event that took place on Sunday here, leading up into this event. What do you think about this basic question of youth at the table? I mentioned this morning the idea that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So how do you think we're doing in having youth at the table? And more important, what's making it difficult, and where do we go next?
Okay, thank you, Katherine. And Ambassador Salah, amen to that. I was itching in my seat to just say for it. If I were to have a fancy PowerPoint presentation, it would have the title, Giving Youth a Place at the Table, right? And then I would have this animated strike-through that would fly across the screen and land on that title and wipe out the words, a place at. And it would leave us with Giving Youth the Table. And so I want to share 3 examples of what this means. This may seem totally crazy, but I'll give you 3 examples very quickly of how this works and how well this works. I'll give you a professional example, I'll give you an ecclesiastical example, and I'll give you one that engages in civil society to kind of try to cover everybody that may be here. So the professional example, for 10 years, I directed the work of the Center for Interfaith and Cultural Dialogue at Griffith University in Australia. And a few years into that, we, like every university center, we had wonderful students who came as interns and worked with us. But a few years into that, I thought, I'm going to change the question I ask when I interview these students before I offer them a role. And the question I asked is, how can the center help you advance the work that you want to do someday? What is a project that the center can help support you do while you're here? It was remarkable, the ideas. Not every student, of course, had great ideas and did great work with it. But some of the best work that we did locally at our center was led by the students, and we supported them in that. It was fabulous. Smartest move I ever made, I think, as director, was giving that table to them. An ecclesiastical example is, for many years, I served as a bishop in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And during that time, a few of those years, I had a congregation that was made up of young single adults between the ages of 18 and 30. And so the head of our women's organization was a young single adult between the ages of 18 and 30. The head of our men's organization, the same. The head of our Sunday school and leading the instruction for the entire congregation. All of these people, my executive secretary, all the great leadership that we had were youth in this age group. They're the ones who came up with, what are the themes that are most important for us? How do we address it? How do we work together? What are the projects we want to give to the community when we give service? And I was able to sit at the table with them, but they ran it, and they did wonderfully well. For 3 years, I had that wonderful opportunity. And the third example is already over my three. Oh,
You can quickly give your
I'll
third.
give the third example very quickly. Is Ackway. More than 10 years ago, we've been going for 10 years now, but more than 10 years ago, the founder of Ackway, Rawad Mayoub, came up with the idea, let's have an organization not just focused on the youth, but led by the youth. And so our executive committee, our organizing committee, all the work they do, this is the youth that's doing. I'm the chair of the board of trustees, but my job is to support the executive director, Lilia, who is here. My job is to help maintain governance structure and all of that. But the work that is done, the issues that we address, the partners with whom we engage, this is all driven by these amazing youth that lead our organization. And so there is always risk when you have any human deciding what the table is. But the reality is, it works if you give youth the table. And so that's the general message I want to leave today. Thank you very much.
Okay, very clear message. We come now to Sean Cleary. I don't know if Sean even knows how he's influenced the G20 interfaith, because he was involved in the German presidency of the G20, where the basic message was that if we were not addressing G20 issues, we were irrelevant. And Sean corresponds regularly with the Secretary General of the UN and Vatican leaders, et cetera. So he's very much involved in global governance issues. So he'll help us to sort of help frame where we're going on these complex issues that we're dealing with.
I'd love to be able to help, Katherine. I think on the way to helping, I'm going to make it more difficult. I'm a great believer in the underlying proposition that diagnosis has to precede prescription. And I'm going to build on where Jose began, but many of you have spoken to the same issues. There are two sets of problems, one of which relates to each one of us individually, qua mammals, and I think everyone in this room is probably a mammal. Mammals are basically driven by three neurochemical urges. This is a vast oversimplification, but forgive me. The first is fear. It enables you to survive. The survival of the species is a function of being able to perceive threats, and as a consequence, you survive. That's driven by the amygdala into the adrenal system, which produces adrenaline and cortisol, and so we survive. The second is want. Want is a function of two things, and forgive the brutality, but it's lust and greed. Lust ensures the survival of the species, hence the enormous growth of the population of Africa at this particular point in time. And greed enables essentially what the squirrel does in collecting nuts before the winter. It enables survival in tough times. This is a series of dopamine issues, and every one of us is driven by them. We modulate them if we're sensible, but broadly speaking, it is a second driver. And the third is something where women have an enormous advantage. It's social empathy. It's driven preeminently by a neurochemical hormone called oxytocin, and it is released preeminently during breastfeeding. Men have the best shot at getting that if they watch a beautiful sunset. When those three are in balance, communities thrive. When those three are not in balance, when fear or greed or lust dominate and social empathy is in recession, we get the world we've got today, which is why Jose is worried about it. And what have we got today? A surge in geopolitical conflict, the collapse of normative acceptance of the same rules across the entire landscape, including peremptory provisions of international law that we think of as jus cogens. And all of that is happening on the cusp of the largest technological revolution in human history, which is combining infotech, biotech, nanotech, and neurotech simultaneously with enormously disruptive effects. I'll come back to a little bit of contribution on prescription later, but that's our challenge.
Great.
Yes.
Well, I think we have our challenges set out very, very vividly and very clearly. And just coming back to our first challenge of religion at the table, we obviously have to ask which tables. I'm going to go back through each one of you very quickly for 1 minute, and then we'll try to open it up. I don't even know how much time we have left. Someone can give me a clue as to where we are on the timing, since I don't have a clock in front of me. But the basic question is, how do we bridge these divides? And I do want to come very quickly back to a history of my life that many of you know, that I worked in the World Bank at the time that the president, Jim Wolfensohn, saw a huge gap in the understandings of international development because there was no place for the religious voice, and so launched a dialogue. But the first piece of that story is that there was enormous opposition from almost every government that was represented at the World Bank, 183 governments. And Wolfensohn, with a slight exaggeration, was fond of saying it was 0 to 183. But the basic discussions came to, first of all, that religion was seen as a source of conflict and tension, that conflicts are religious. The second is perhaps one that we're grappling with a bit more directly, which is the idea that many religious institutions oppose elements that are seen as central to development. And that is the role of women, for example, and the reproductive health issues and some other very basic ethical issues. And the third was a false assumption that religion would become less important with development, and therefore it comes back to another word we're hearing often here, which is priority. In other words, where are you putting your emphasis? So we've worked now for about 25 years, all of us in our different places and in our different roles, to change the understandings and to change it. But we're also facing a world where other polarizations and divisions between, for example, development and humanitarian work, the peace-building world, economics, and social are also breaking down in new kinds of institutions. So if each of you could give us a couple of minutes of wisdom on what you think we should do, both as the G20 Interfaith, but also each of us from where we are. So Jose, over to you.
Before I spoke very positively and hopeful about religion. Religion is part of the problem. Our religious institutions are also part of the problem. My own Catholic Church has two problems. One, it's part of the world, and therefore it's polarized within as much as the world is polarized. Certainly the US Catholic Church was totally polarized under Francis. Hopefully, Pope Leo, being American, thinking more moderate, conservative, can have the power to tell Vice President Vance your voice when you said that we must love ourselves first and our family and our citizens, and later, if there is some love, we can live for the others. That this is not a Catholic, this is not a Christian vision. And so, we need to have prophetic voice within the church to silence those who in the name of religion are saying something which is simply should not be said. And second, the question of gender is crucial. It's crucial even for self-survival. Why Europe is so secular? Because women stop going to church. Mm-hmm. And if women stop going to church, there are no children in the church. Mm-hmm. So it's back to the question. So unless, and today, young women do not view the church clerical leadership with credibility. Mm. Even if they like what they say, they don't listen because they have no authority. They have lost the moral authority. So we have to, that's why I mentioned the sisters. You have the power to change the church from within. And you have to do it because it's your own voice that we need within the church. The real problem in many of our institutions is males. Males. It is these males that have no empathy and therefore greed and for lust. You women have to help us, have to help us to be better mammals. And that's what you do very well. I mean, we need so much, before we become humans, we need so much you mothers for us to become humans. But you have to continue doing that. So it's very important. As long as the Catholic Church talks of gender ideology, we're in trouble. We're in trouble. Because a way of shutting up the very question of women inequality within the church.
Needless to say, I'm quite empathetic with what Jose says, and I would add grandmothers.
Yes, well, of course, women.
But let me turn, I jumped over because Jose was smiling at me. But Susie, where do you see us going during this very, shall we say, complex and demanding time where we find ourselves?
Yeah, I was having coffee several years ago with His Holiness the Karmapa before an event that we were having at USIP, and I was talking to him about this current moment, and he was reminding me of the Buddhist and Hindu ideas of cycles of degeneration and regeneration, or destruction and creation that are endlessly going on. And he said, wisely and obviously, we're in a period of destruction. And it resonates with the Christian idea of destruction, creation, destruction or death, recreation or resurrection. That there are these moments of things falling apart and new things being born. I think it's obvious to me that we are in a very dangerous time, as we've all noted up here. The falling apart of norms and various institutions in the post-war order that have sought to advance human rights and to reduce suffering, human suffering, planetary suffering. And at the same time, I want to go back to something I said I want to make sure I'm not coming across as Pollyanna or callous in saying that I think there are reasons to find optimism for the opportunities that exist in this moment as things fall apart, for us to reimagine. There's a lot of movements right now that are looking backwards and are romanticizing moments in the past, orders of the past. and are trying to recreate those. We have that in the United States with the Make America Great Again movement. Core to that is this sort of romanticization of past orders and ways of being that were very patriarchal and so on and so forth. But what are we doing to be forward-looking in these moments and to say, how are we moving forward as these institutions that in some ways were feeding economic inequalities, feeding the exploitation of peoples and of the planets and of creation, that we're feeding into the desacralization of the world? How are we reimagining how to reform our institutions in ways that are far more integrated and interdependent? And I think, to get back to what Brian was saying, I'm not sure that my generation or the generations above me are able to do a lot of that reimagining ourselves, because we're so stuck in thinking about the ways we've been ordered in the past in the liberal political order, right? It's hard to imagine recreating a USAID, for example, the development organization in the US, for me, myself, without jettisoning the way it was done in the past. But when I look at how youth have organized in my country, when I look at how, like in Myanmar, for example, I'm looking at Mu, the way in which the youth led the post-coup resistance movement, or in Sri Lanka, the uprising that happened in 2022, that was youth-led, and the religious leaders who are older came behind them and followed them for the first time in Sri Lankan and Myanmar history with democracy movements or human rights movements. And the way that the youth were so intersectional and pluralist, ethnically and religiously so, and how they organized that movement and how they represented that movement, how they integrated art and into the forms of resistance that were happening. That's where I think we need to be led in doing this reimagining work, is being led by generations that aren't trapped in the ways of thinking about organizing ourselves politically and socially from the models of the past.
Someone made a comment to me some years ago that we're still living in a world where there are formal institutions with which we're all very familiar, and I would put these, Sean, even in the global governance, but that the real way things are happening now is different. And the way that decisions are being made is not primarily within the formal structures, but within others that we can barely discern, which is, I think, an interesting challenge. So I'm now going to turn to Bonnie and see how you're looking forward from the places where you're sitting.
Very optimistically. We are seeing difficult times, but if you really look back, historically, even 50 years, 60 years, we are still in a better place. We are having these conversations, for one, which I don't think were possible even 20 years ago. The fact that youth are empowered to even imagine a table where they would be permitted to be at is progress. We are seeing women taking on, in their churches, in their religious life, they're taking on roles that were not seen before, and we are seeing a lot of advance in that regard as well. And I think I come from a faith tradition where we don't have clergy, so pretty much everything is done in consultation at the grassroots with everyone in the community. And there's a lot happening informally, as you were suggesting, Katherine. The one thing that I do want to remind us as faith actors, and for secular actors that are working for the well-being of humanity, we need to be able to step out of our comfort zones and work with others that we may not typically have been comfortable working with. You asked me about freedom of religion or belief. It's freedom of religion or belief. So even the right not to believe is one. So, when we are engaging in this, in the conversations that are form related, we are working with atheists and humanists. It's not always comfortable for faith actors to work with them, or vice versa. But the issue is about promoting a particular human right. So we have got to get very comfortable, women of faith, feminists, to work together and not have all those old suspicions that drive the wedges between our actions, but really look at what brings us together. And when we are working together, we can really advance. And I second what Susan said. This is a moment of opportunity. There are many opportunities. Please, let's learn our lessons so that when things calm down, we don't go right back to doing business as usual. This is our opportunity to think creatively and really look for change.
The optimism that you feel here reminds me of one of my favorite Madeleine Albright quotes, which is that I'm an optimist who worries a lot. And I think there's an element to that. So I think you're another optimist, Salah. So over to you. How do you see some of the next stages?
I came from a family of a Muslim father and a Christian mother. And that's how I've been raised, to understand and respect both religions in the same house. My father was a trader, and sometimes he will not be around for months, years. So I have been raised solely by my mother, just like my other brothers and sisters. And that is why I always proudly describe myself as a he for she. Why? Because I do believe that women has a very strong role to play, not only in raising children, but also in sustaining peace within communities and societies. And therefore, they have to be allowed, I would say, to play that role, and not really to be challenged. And they need to be supported, and they need to be allowed to play that role. This is number one. Number two, there was a question that Professor Casanova tried to answer about whether religions are contributing to violence or they are causing violence in Africa. We see so many practical, if you can say practical situations as examples in Nigeria, in Sudan today, in Rwanda, 1994, and many other African countries where religions, unfortunately, were misinterpreted by the leaders of the various tribes and traditional leaders in favor of fueling the wars and the civil wars and the conflicts that erupted and killed millions of Africans. That is why the African Union currently is quite busy, in fact, involving religious institutions in the development of the various instruments and treaties and policies that we have. We just recently concluded the PCRD, the Post-Conflict Reconstruction Policy Framework, and we realized that the participation of the various religious leaders and the other civil society and media organizations was really quite helpful in sharing ideas and thoughts that were not really available at the table during the beginning of the drafting of that particular policy. What I'm trying to say is that religions, as we all know, came for the betterment of the well-being and the welfare of the mankind. But unfortunately, because of interpretations from some leaders of these religions, things can go wrong. So the question is how religions could be, in fact, in a place to play a role in enhancing peace and security and stability and tolerance among the societies and communities, I would say, here in Africa, in order we can build the Africa we want and the Africa we deserve. Again, I think it is quite important to strengthen the current bridges that are in existence, but also to build new bridges between the various sectors and institutions so we can ensure that the voices of all African people is heard, especially those who are at the grassroots level, far away without any access to electricity or mobile phones or internet or any kind of communication service. Last but not least, Dr. Katherine, in many cases, I think we need to also look into the kind of education we currently have in our school systems. What kind of history are we teaching our kids? What kind of information are we trying to feed our children through the education curriculums that we currently have in place? I'm saying this because I think even today, when we come to speak about what happened in Rwanda, we still loudly speak about Tutsi and Hutu. We mentioned the same two tribes that fought or killed each other in 1994. And now we are reminding the new generation of a responsibility that they were not part of. So I think what we really need to do today is to look into our history books, to look into what we are really having as part of our school curriculum today, in order for us to make sure that the next set of leaders that we are preparing today will do the right thing and make the right decisions. I submit. Thank you.
I was working on Rwanda and Burundi in the 70s and 80s, in other words, leading up. And one of the questions I think we need to ask ourselves constantly, as all of the actors, including those from outside, was what we might have done differently. Because the one thing we can't say is that we didn't see. We knew what was going on. We knew the divides, but we were not bold enough and creative enough. Please, we're going to have some time for a conversation that extends beyond the panel. We're calling it sort of a fishbowl. So please get ready, and I presume some mics will eventually materialize. But meanwhile, Brian, what are the things you're hearing? You have a special seat, a special privilege of being so much engaged with some of the more creative young people around in the world thinking about these issues. Where do we go?
Were you the one who came up with the title of this panel, Katherine? Because I really like it. So often when we gather together, I like a lot of what you do. So often we talk about building bridges between sectors or between institutions or between communities. And that's how I've framed a lot of the work that I've done. But the reality is, there are already a lot of bridges there. How do we help people cross those? And I want to talk about a particular bridge that exists already. And it's not at the 30,000 feet level that we've been talking about, but it's at the very local level at the community. And then youth engagement is an example of this. But almost every faith community with which I've worked have within their teachings, their doctrine, their theology, this idea of positive contribution to the community. Yes, we have things like take care of the poor and the orphan and the widows, of course, but too often we forget the scope of the mandate that we've been given by divine revelation or inspiration, and that it extends beyond the walls of our own communities. So when as I mentioned, I was serving as a bishop, I wasn't just I didn't have to be just the bishop of the congregation for which I was responsible. I actually had a remit much larger than that, and that was to bless the lives of all the people that lived within the geographic boundaries of the area for which I was asked to serve as a bishop. And I think this is an untapped potential, and the flowing up benefits from this are immense. So I'll give you an example. In Cincinnati, we have the church to which I belong has three states, which are geographic organizations of congregations. So three of them. It's a significant presence. But we pale in comparison to the Catholics, for example. Very, very strong, very engaged community throughout Cincinnati. But whenever, let's say, the Cincinnati City Council has an initiative on addressing youth issues, we don't see someone from my church, for example, or even a Catholic parish or the archdiocese or the diocese there, who works with youth on that board. Not because they would be pushed away or anything, but we don't put our hand up for it. It's almost as if we have accepted the fact that we no longer, as faith communities broadly, we accept the fact that we no longer have public legitimacy, and that therefore we are to remain within our own area. And I think that's our own fault. For some reason, we gave in to that argument, and that there's so much more we can do. And in so doing, not only would we be bringing, faith values or perspectives, but we'd be bringing great strength to these initiatives, and we would be addressing this question, this challenge to faith communities of what value are you outside of your own special interests? So that's where I see a lot of hope when I think of optimistically. And I must point out, my sisters and brothers in the Baha'i community are very good at this, at engaging beyond, not just in a proselytism manner, but engaging beyond and strengthening their communities. I have a bit of religious envy, if you don't mind, for some of the work that they do.
Well done.
Religious envy, I like that, as well as collaboration. But I think the point that you're focusing on is, again, part of the discourse and the dialogue, but not necessarily the real lived priority, which is community. What do we mean by community? Because communities are so different today, and they're changing and dynamic. Sean, I don't think any of us will forget your lesson about fear, greed, lust, and empathy. That was a very graphic reminder of our drives. But perhaps you can take us to the next stage of where you see us going to cross these divides and bridges.
Thanks, Katherine. The really interesting thing, and I want to go back to something that Susie began with in a certain sense. I don't know if you were consciously quoting from William Butler Yeats or not, but that's the thrust, of course, of what he wrote in 1919 in The Second Coming. And you may recall in the religious context that the Second Coming is precisely Christ's return to Jerusalem onto the earth. So the underlying logic of that, in a certain sense, epitomizes some of the discussion on this panel extremely well. But there's a horrible line in the first stanza of The Second Coming, which I think describes the challenge that we face right now. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are fired with passionate intensity. And if I have a look at the global structures at the moment, I fear that's writ large. Yeah. We are in an age of excessive nationalism, primitive mercantilism, and a reversion to military expenditure on unprecedented levels since 1991. That's where we are.
Yes.
I'm not telling you that to scare you. You can have a look at all of the data. That's where we are. The tariffs, CIPRI's reports on military expenditure, the doomsday clock at 89 seconds to midnight. That's where we are. So the real question is not that, it's what do we do about it? And the only way that we can do something about it is by reverting to the norms that enable social and community, comity, interaction, learning from one another, and advancing the benefits of being human in society. If we don't do that, we all fail. Everyone sitting here and everyone else on planet Earth today. The only purpose of government is to advance the well-being of the citizenry. Mm-hmm. It has no other purpose. Mm-hmm. We don't need governments to decide what to have for lunch. Mm-hmm. We need governments in order to ensure that there is something to eat in a society that permits people to live with a relative degree of peace vis-a-vis one another. If governments could remember that, if governments could recall that it is not the government that is sovereign, but the people that are sovereign, And the reason for the sovereignty of the people in the context of the 18th century emergence of that thesis is precisely because, to use the American Declaration of Independence, we believe these things to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the logic. But we forget it. We lose it. And when you are 8.2 billion people on a planet, then you have to manage the commons with a degree of understanding and sophistication which transcends what an American president or a French president or a president of a country in the Sahel, before a military coup or after, may decide to do. You have to be able to think about the whole. And there are hundreds of biblical and related religious text references that explain this, but I'm going to take a secular one for a start. Clifford Geertz makes the very simple proposition that culture is the social context for meaning. And the challenge that we have is to find a degree of collective culture, a sense of why we are on this earth. Each one of us will interpret that in our own faith tradition or in a secular tradition. Each one of us will frame it slightly differently. But that collective understanding that we are here for the benefit of all is the most fundamental change that we need to bring about at this point in time. Sectarianism, sectionalism, political divides, none of that makes any sense under today's circumstances. We've transgressed 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. We're roughly $4 trillion behind in respect of meeting the SDGs. Roughly 3.4 trillion people live, close to half of the population of the world, in societies that spend more on debt service than they spend on health or education. How on earth can that be the world we want to live in? It makes no sense. So the challenge is to find purpose, understand that our collective obligation is to enable well-being. We can argue about how. We can argue about precisely what well-being constitutes. That's what intellectual discourse is all about. But we mustn't lose sight of that central purpose. Because if we don't do that, frankly, we're not human. We are not created in the image of God. So I'll close, ironically, with an Italian communist fighting Mussolini. Antonio Gramsci, of course, is the one that I'm going for. I am a pessimist by dint of reason, but I am an optimist by force of will. And that's what I'd encourage for all of you.
I certainly think that leaves us with an enormous task, even more than a challenge, which is to try to revitalize this sense of the common good and of the common purpose and the common humanity, which Bonnie also reminded us of, in the context of a world where diversity is growing and is increasing. Plural societies are increasingly the norm. So now the time is for people to raise their hands, and I see lots of hands. So why don't we start very quickly? Let's start with Musimbi at the back in the yellow, and then we'll move over. I guess we'll go to the far left then, and then to Lynn. So that's the first 3. So we're going to take a lot of comments, quick comments. How much time do we have? About 20 minutes? 15, okay. So you're going to have a minute each.
I very much appreciate the panel, and since I would like to hear many other people, I'm going to stick to one point. The point of the cost of inclusion. I think we do talk about inclusion, and there are various ways we could think about inclusion. You can widen the table and get more people on, or extend it. But once you have got people at that table, if the table conversation continues to be the same, you haven't included. So for example, if we want to have young people and women at the table, what are we willing to actually, how are we willing to change the nature of the conversation? If I'm at the table and we are talking about the money we save from taxes, and at the same time, we are not able to address the fact that even a subject that has not appeared here, the reproductive health of women, unless we have that looked after. If we are not able to address the fact that little girls in our homes, in our streets, are not safe, if we're not able to address the fact that a hungry child who ends up in my lap as the mom is the concern for hunger, how does that table conversation change? So I want to say to us, if we're going to have women and young people, the table conversation has to change. And we have to be willing not to say we have welcomed them to our institutions, we have permitted them to participate, because that means that the ownership is not a collective ownership. People are just joining in order to be there. I would like to encourage you all to read the new book by the former president of New Zealand, A Different Kind of Power, and see the struggle that she had to lead a country while also bleeding, while also having a baby. And I would like to say, let's not make inclusion cheap. It is expensive, and it is asking more of us than we are able to face. And women and young people, we do have what it takes to deal with the economics, to deal with theology, but we also want to bring, if you say we have empathy, we want that empathy to matter in what we talk about. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Imby. You went a little over your minute, but it was worth hearing.
I will assist by being quick. Let me start by a quote from the Christian Bible. I think it's Proverbs 23:18. The future looks bright and is filled with hope that can never fade away. And you spoke about being optimistic by the force of will. So if we are to say, if you talk about young people, we can't talk about young people without the young people, right? Nothing for us without us. So young people are the future. If we're not on the table, we have to create our own table. So what is it that we are saying? We are saying that we have to inspire hope. And I think that the religious leaders and churches, they are failing in terms of advising and mentoring young and upcoming young people. So I think that we need to play a major role. When I was growing up, there was a lot of support and advisory and mentorship and support, but now we are not preparing for the next generation. So that's my input. I think in the next panels and discussions, let's be more inclusive in terms of young people, but let's also inspire hope, because I think that there's a lot that we can do in terms of taking action rather than just having events and events. Thank you.
Thank you. We hear you. So who are the others? Okay, then we'll go to you next, and then to you.
Okay, good. So I've been so excited by what I've heard here and resonated, and I'm so happy to hear neuroscience brought into the picture so very compellingly, because I do feel that in reforming our grooves as opposed to the disrupted ruts, we do have an opportunity. I mean, do you want to go back and reconstruct based on what we knew then, or are we going to have a look at how we do engage with one another? And I specialize in the neuroscience of leadership. There are programs out there. You know, I'm surprised that it hasn't been mentioned more here, because it's fundamental to our social intelligence. We know about IQ and EQ, but social intelligence is what's going to help us cross these bridges. It's trust that has been broken that needs to be rebuilt. And yes, it's the oxytocin. And we might attribute a lot more of the responsibility, therefore, to women. And fantastic, bring us in, because we do have those kinds of skills. But men, now that you've heard that it's kind of lower in your case, but still there, and know this, it's testosterone. It's power that sometimes dampens down that empathy. So the very thing, the passion that brings you to the positions of power that you have, can inadvertently, without your knowledge, be dampening down the emotions, the empathy you had for the people who voted you into that. So there's just so much to be gleaned from neuroscience we should be using, and we can, if we pick a project and then support it as the elders here, I believe so much can be done. But let's pick projects before we leave and make this all happen. Thank you.
We've been reminded forcibly that we need to keep biology in mind. Let's go to our, somebody with the highest hand raised. Yes.
I just want to say thank you, Katherine, for bringing hope in the world as a mother. And we can touch your motherly empathy in the world. I sit in the African Union and SADC as the UN convener for traditional and religious leaders. And we are invited to develop instruments for government that end up sitting on the ivory towers and they are not implemented. And then if government has made good connections, then the resources goes to the government. And we who've been taking the issues of the margins, the left behind population, we are left behind. And we'll continue attending gatherings and talking to the people who are left behind, yet we are the decision makers. So my appeal to you, Katherine, I see the nuns here. I would like to do advocacy engagement. I was so hopeful to see the World Bank having coffee with the World Bank, eating together. I would like to appeal that now it's time to use a church, the nuns, the faith communities, the traditional leaders, in a discerning manner so that we transform communities, because you find this bilateral between the AU, UN, EU with the government, but when it comes to implementing community of science, we become the victims by the government. So I see hope and future through this gathering and starting strategic partnership. And it's so humbling to see the nuns. I used to live with the nuns in Australia and Germany, the Sisters of Mary, who advocate for true justice. But when it comes to financing, they become left behind, and then these big institutions, agencies, UN, then they're saying, no, we're gonna work through the government. World Bank saying, we work through the government, but the people who develop the narratives are us as mothers and the intercessors, the prayer warriors who've been crying, bringing the heaven on earth. But when it comes to implementation, now it's government. So I'm so hopeful. Thank you so much, Katherine. Thank you so much, Sean Clary. Oh, my word. Thank you.
Thank you. We hear you. Let's take a couple more, and then I want to give the panel a quick chance to come to the end. And we're going to go next to the far corner, and that, I'm afraid, is going to be it.
Hi, everyone. A few of the points that the panelists raised are very important, and I'm just bringing this up. So between my friends, we're about all in the age group of like 33 or so, and then my siblings are a lot younger. None of us speak about religion with each other. We talk about everything else, but we don't talk about religion with each other. And part of that reason that ends up happening is just because one of my friends, he's a preacher's kid, as we like to call. We often share a lot of religious trauma amongst each other, and we talk about that, but we don't talk about the good that religion and interfaith brings. So sometimes the difficulty is that we don't remember the good that religion gave us and that sense of community that we had. You know, we learned empathy at the start, but because sometimes some of the negative narratives are a lot harder to overcome. So I think sometimes interfaith organizations forget that sometimes the most vulnerable aren't the perfect vulnerable, if there's a way to make sense, that they aren't the most people who are the right kind of homeless or the right kind of person who we're supposed to help. So oftentimes the most vulnerable get villainized, and sometimes that creates a barrier, because when we see, okay, someone who's like me or who's like my friend, because my younger siblings also have queer friends who often get villainized in sometimes religious spaces, they're like, okay, well, if you're treating my friend or my family member in such a way where you're villainizing them, why should I be receptive? So I just think sometimes we have to just change the messaging towards acceptance and kind of like learning to cross the barrier, as Barney Dougal raised earlier, was just very integral and very salient. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So if you can take the mic to the far corner, and meanwhile I'm going to give you a factoid that I find a bit overwhelming. You know, we now have, 8.2 billion people in the world, something like that. You can find out easily how many were there when you were born. But when I was born, it was only just over 2 billion. So in my lifetime, we've gone from 2 billion to 8 billion. And that does make, I think, the task of inclusion especially challenging. So last question, and then I'm going to turn for each of you to, you're going to get about one sentence. I'm not going to say one word, but a sentence.
Thank you so much. I'll just speak on one point. I'm Nick Talvale. From Jose, systems are broken, and we are spending energy building on what is broken. That is a fundamental statement. How do we pick from here? And pick from here with the hope to come to participate in shaping and continue shaping the world we are looking for. I think for faith communities we need to look at this. Then the question is, when we start looking at what is broken from within the place of children, women, young people, in the faith communities, most likely we could be contributing enormously in rebuilding what is broken, because we may think it's out there, but it's a key issue. But I think it raises concern. How do we keep building and expecting results from what is broken? Most likely, that's the conversation for the future, and for us to participate in from family level, as faith communities, to the local congregations in faith communities, and bringing it to the subnational and national levels. How do we look at participating in sort of constructing a new world? Because there is a lot of brokenness. Thank you so much to all the presenters and Katherine for mediating all this.
Great. Well, let's just go down the line and start with Jose.
Well,
Sentence, Jose.
Sentence. Thank you so much. It has been a great conversation. Thank you to my colleagues, and thank you to all of you. And let's continue and now move to action also. That's it.
Salah.
I do agree with everything that has been said, and I thank you for your contributions.
I'm going to have a longer run-on sentence. I want to go back to tables. I think a lot of us have had the experience of a table being extended in the sense that in the interfaith world, for example, there's a Christian organization and they're doing a kind of initiative and they want to make it more inclusive, so they invite others into it. Or there's a conference that's been organized and they realize they don't have enough women speakers, so they add in some women speakers. It's an extension. They're adding a leaf onto the table. I'm a Jesus follower. I want to flip the tables. I want to throw out the tables. I want to completely transform the way that we do these things. And we have so many technology tools. We have, 6 billion more people than when Katherine was born, but we also have all these new technology tools that can facilitate greater kinds of inclusion and different ways of organizing. So that's where I want to move as we think about how to do things differently, is completely transforming. And everything's being transformed right now because everything's topsy-turvy right now in the world. So again, let's see that as an opportunity.
Creative. Brian.
You used a lot of semicolons in there.
I know.
That sentence. But I'm going to borrow that. Susie, that's the thing that I will take away from this is something that you said, and that I really have been struggling lately thinking of how does someone who works in my field face what we're facing, this avalanche, this tsunami. And while it insinuates some challenges ahead, I'm going to take away the fact that you said this is an opportunity to rebuild, to restructure, to create, because we couldn't have done it the way they were in place. So I thank you very much for that, and I thank all of you for letting me be here, be part of this.
So when religious communities work in partnership with others, with collaborators from all sectors of society, government, and business, they can harmonize efforts around the proposition that the path to a better world is not only one of technological adjustment, but also involves societies learning to align themselves with higher principles. And I think that is what we all need to aspire to.
In 1992, South Africa was losing about 4,000 people a month to intersectional violence, preeminently in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng in terms of today's landscape, but across the country. The churches and business got together, 12 people, created something that became known as the National Peace Accord in 3 months. Set up the Convention for a Democratic South Africa and enabled the political transition by 1994. It could not have been done in any other way. Government had tried and failed. The South African Council of Churches on its own had tried and failed. But the crisis led to a solution. That's where we are.
You've reminded us of the famous acronym that crisis is at the same time danger and opportunity. That's right. The Chinese character.
That's right.
I'm going to end with 3 things. The first is warm thanks to my friends and extraordinary panelists who have very creative ideas, who are cockeyed optimists, but at the same time with their feet firmly grounded in reality, each one of them in their own way. A second comment is a lesson from my years in the World Bank, that our concern and our focus is on those who are vulnerable, those who are the poorest of the poor, the people whose voices are not heard, nothing about us without us. But we also know that you cannot establish the common good without involving everyone. It has to go beyond simply the most vulnerable, that just saying we care only about the poor will not generate the kind of common purpose that we need. So we need to find ways to have the broader message. And the third is a challenge that I know we're facing here, and Doug Fountain has reminded me of it periodically, which is how do we cross the bridge between the very global, the G20 agenda, the speech by Ramaphosa, the speech by leaders, and what people are feeling at the local level. And clearly, packing food yesterday was one way to do that. Community projects are another. But we need to focus a lot more on crossing maybe that ladder, if we can call it. It's a bridge, but it's also a ladder that really takes us from these very broad principles of SDGs and the noble thoughts that we have about the common welfare, the common good, and how that translates into action that each one of us can do, but each of our institutions can do, large or small. But I'm very conscious in this setting of that particular challenge of extending from the very, very global to what we can see and feel at a very human level, whether it's as parents and grandparents, members of a community. So I think we need to work on finding better ways to work on the ladder. So thank you to all of you, and have a good lunch.
Well done.
I think that turned out.
vulnerable are being neglected and even suffering more than ever before. People across the world are dealing with crises associated with conflict, climate change, and inequity linked to policies and structural injustice.